our second speaker of this morning is Dr. Aleksandra McClain, who is Senior Lecturer in Archaeology at the University of York. And her work is on the Anglo-Norman period, particularly kind of transitions and cultural context, but really grounded in a really sensible local context. And that's sort of the really distinguishing feature of Alex's work. And I'll say her work on the Norman period, Norman conquest, and the archaeology associated with it is genuinely brilliant. I've learned a lot from her insights over the years. And that's really on the basis of asking similar questions with different types of evidence. And we'll hear a little bit about that today, I'm sure. As well as a really deep understanding of York, of Yorkshire, and of the North. And so I'm really delighted to introduce Alex, and today she'll be speaking on resistance, resilience, and recovery in York and the North. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you. I'm going to remember that you said I'm brilliant when I get to the slide that has coins on it, and then you're going to make sure you don't tell me if I'm wrong. Right, okay, so thank you very much for organizing this conference and inviting me to speak alongside my lovely colleagues. I'm really excited about the Bayeux Tapestry. I've been a very lonely Norman conquest archaeologist for a long time, and I'm excited that finally the Normans are getting a little bit of a spotlight. My husband does Vikings, and so he gets all the attention all the time, and I've been telling him, it's my time now. So what I'm going to focus on today is the story of the north of England in the Norman conquest, which of all the narratives that get told about 1066, it's often the most one note. It's often all about northern rebellion and resistance to Norman rule after the Battle of Hastings. But even more than that, it's about William the Conqueror's military retaliation in the winter of 1069-70, which has become known as the Harrying of the North. So we don't get many competing narratives or much nuance about how the Norman conquest might have contributed to northern life and culture rather than just destroying it. So I'll start with this visual, which is from a poll question I asked the audience at a lecture that Sarah organized a few years ago about what comes to mind when you think about the Norman conquest of the North. And we had, I think, about 100 people there, so I finally got a good sense of sort of popular thoughts about the Norman conquest of the North. And these were my results. And the words mentioned here are, if they were mentioned more, they're bigger. So the harrying obviously dominates the popular perceptions. We also get lots of negative words: atrocity, desolation, oppression, subjugation, starvation, decimation. So there's clearly not a lot of nuance in this story. The Norman conquest was bad for the North. And we can see the same view echoed in popular media. So I won't play this, but you can find it, I think, on YouTube, because I don't think you can hear it if I press play. But this is Dan Snow, his Norman walks. Imagine me talking in posh Dan Snow voice. He says, they have a long memory in these parts, and if you mention William the Conqueror to a Yorkshireman, you'll get an earful. So my next poll is if you're from Yorkshire, do you want to punch people when they mention William the Conqueror? But he kind of relates that kind of same story, that it was desolation, genocide, all those sorts of things. But after that, I've got a little bit of a confession to make. I got asked a few years ago to do a little bit of a talking head thing for a Sky History program, but they didn't tell me what it was called. And I said, yeah, sure. They wanted me to go to Pontefract and talk about the Norman conquest and the harrying of the North, and I did that, and I talked for like an hour, and all this nuance and all these like archaeology and history and all the evidence, and they edited it down to about 5 minutes where I was just like, blood, death, fire. And so now I look like a complete hypocrite if you watch that, but I'm going to still give Dan Snow more of a hard time because he has more control over the edits than I do. So we even see this perception seeping into education, into popular culture. So this is the Key Stage 3 BBC bite-size about the harrying of the North, burning. These are the headlines. I love Was William the Conqueror a war criminal? The real story of the harrying of the North. And it shows up in memes. I had the most fun kind of searching the internet for all the memes about the Norman conquest. And most of these are not about the North, but you really see that kind of antagonistic, the Normans are acquisitive, land-grabbing, murderous, they're even unwanted immigrants. So no, Anglo-Saxon England is full, you can't come in. So where does this narrative come from? And the answer is historical chronicles, which were mostly written in the 50 to 100 years after the conquest. They not only all agree that William came up and he attacked the north with an unprecedented kind of ferocity, but some of them are also particularly lurid in their descriptions of the treatment that the rebellious northerners got. So from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he came up and with all his troops, and he sacked the town and slew many hundred persons, and he profaned St. Peter's Minster. When the king heard of the arrival of Spain in Denmark, he went northward with all the troops he could collect and laid waste to all the shire, and that's as good as it gets, because Orderic Vitalis says he made no effort to control his fury. He punished the innocent with the guilty. More than 100,000 people died of hunger. I've often praised William, but I can say nothing good about this God will punish him. Florence of Worcester, very similar. Severe famine prevailed in most parts of the kingdom, chiefly in Northumbria. Men were driven to feed on the flesh of horses, dogs, cats, and even of human beings. And Sabine of Durham, for 9 years, there was nobody to cultivate the land. There was no village inhabited between York and Durham. So we can see where this popular narrative comes from. And the other primary source of information that informs this kind of dominant narrative of the Norman Conquest of the North is Doomsday Book. And what has been particularly paid attention to is the prevalence of the phrase wasta est, wasta est. So it is waste throughout northern England, and particularly Yorkshire. And in these two maps from Clifford Darby's Doomsday Geography of England, we can see, so the north of England, all these dots there are waste villages, particularly in Yorkshire, and this is the North Riding of Yorkshire, and all of these are uninhabited villas in 1086. So you can see how prevalent that was. And traditionally, the interpretation has been that the waste and the low population numbers we see are a direct statistical representation of the effects of the harrying 20 years after the fact. But that correlation has been challenged by a range of historical scholarship, and 2 points that they draw out of that are particularly that doomsday entries of waste are not just a northern phenomenon. We see them all over the country. There's just more of it in the north. And also that many places, especially in the north, were already waste in 1066, before the conquest and the harrying. And so it probably means that an estate had no current agricultural value to tax, either in 1066 or 1086. As opposed to somewhere that got destroyed. So it shows the picture of the north as kind of slowed down economically, but this was happening even before the Normans got to it. But it's easy to see how that's the apparently straightforward story of confrontation and aggression and violent imposition gets perpetuated. But I think one thing that's particularly interesting in the media and the popular consumption versions, unlike in academic scholarship, is that there's no caveats, no critical awareness. There's no 12th century chronicles say, or some documents report that, or any discussion of the particular biases or audiences or religious or political goals of the chroniclers themselves. It also doesn't mention that they're not directly contemporary. Orderic and Simeon aren't even born when the conquest and the harrying happened. So instead, things just get stated as categorical fact. 100,000 people died, it was genocide, there was cannibalism. And I think that lack of criticality of the sources in popular communication is a big part of the perception problem when it comes to the Norman Conquest of the North. So I'm an archaeologist. I deal primarily with material culture, objects, buildings, gravestones, landscapes. And because of this, and some of the things I've written and said about the North and Norman Conquest, I'm pretty sure some historian colleagues of mine, like David Bates, think that I don't believe the harrying happened at all, or it wasn't bad. And that's not really true. I think the cannibalism thing is made up. But what I think has been missing from this story, where I think archaeology can start to make a big contribution, is how we understand this process. How did people get through it and come out the other side? What does everyday resilience look like in the face of a major and possibly very disruptive socio-political change? And what comes after the rebellions and the retribution, which in the grand scheme of things is only 4 years, between 1066 and 1070? How does the North recover? And what did both native people and the Normans actively do as they made the transition between an Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Scandinavian world, which probably has kind of drawn so beautifully for us, and an Anglo-Norman world? And to answer these questions, I'm going to look at a range of archaeological evidence from the late 11th and early 12th centuries in northern England, which I think can help tell a more complicated and more interesting story about the Normans in the north than what the chronicles might lead us to believe. So what does the archaeology, oops, sorry, wrong order, that one first. What does the archaeology of the Norman conquest look like? And that was another poll I asked the same audience, and castles takes center stage. But we also get churches and coins, and I'm going to talk about all of those in just a minute. But I was also interested in how the words rare and lacking and scarce and sparse came up in this question. So there's a lot of thinking that beyond castles and coins and churches, there isn't a lot. And what's interesting is that there actually is a lot of 11th and 12th century archaeology. It just isn't specifically tied to the Norman conquest. It's just sort of happening while the Norman conquest is happening. And so people kind of said, well, it doesn't have anything to do with the Norman conquest. But actually, I think, and it's led us to kind of have this truism that the Norman conquest is invisible in archaeology apart from architecture, basically. But I think we've been going around this sort of the wrong way. We've been trying to find the Norman conquest in the archaeology, but the Norman conquest happened. We don't have to prove it in the archaeology. What we want to think about is that all of this stuff was being created by people while the Norman conquest and its aftermath were happening. So we can explore how people on all levels of society engaged with the material world during this long and complicated transition. And most importantly, we can ask questions about why they did that, considering what was happening around. One of the reasons I think castles come to mind first when people think about the Norman conquest is, one, that they're huge and they're awesome and they survive really well. And they survive really well because they're huge in stone. And they also don't really complicate that standard antagonistic, militaristic Norman imposition narrative. They seem to reinforce it. And while sometimes they do, I want to argue here that even castles are not always as straightforward as they seem. So, fortified manorial sites and enclosures were commonplace in Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Scandinavian England. So the elite package of a lordly fortification, manorial lands, settlement, and often a proprietary church were already very firmly established well before the Normans arrived. But the Motte and Bailey Castle is one of the things that we can say was definitely a Norman importation. There are obviously a number of castles founded pretty much in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, and these were a means of securing the territory, of controlling communication routes, and providing a base for both defense and for attack. And in Yorkshire, these proper kind of Norman conquest castles include both Clifford's Tower and Bailey Hill in York, but also Conisborough, Pickering, Richmond, Pontefract, Skipsey, and some of the others out in the Ridings. Some of them, like York's castles, were built directly by the king, but many were built by barons who had been rewarded with land for their service to William. So William de Warenne, who's really based in Surrey, I think, he is in charge of Conisbrough Castle. But it's important to remember that many of Yorkshire's most well-known Norman castles, so Helmsley, Scarborough, Sandal, are not the immediate result of the conquest at all. They are constructed 50 or even 100 years afterwards, as both major and minor lords tried to establish themselves in the new Anglo-Norman world. So Scarborough is the result of a Yorkshire baron called William of Aumale, and he, by the 1130s, had become Lord of Holderness, so it's a pretty good chunk of East Yorkshire. And this was under King Stephen, which is a very weak kingship, a weak centralized kingship leads to the anarchy. And he took full advantage of that period. He had his eye on being the lord of all of East Yorkshire, if he could manage, and he built the castle at Scarborough without royal permission, which you're generally not supposed to do. So all of this was very useful for William in imposing his authority on the populace of East Yorkshire and reinforcing his control of that territory. But it wasn't really about securing Norman rule in Yorkshire. William was born about 50 years after the conquest was over. So it was about his personal ambition and sending unmistakable messages of power and influence to other barons, to the king, and to his own knightly subtenants. When Henry II reestablishes strong centralized kingship after the anarchy, he claims back many of the unauthorized castles which had been built during that time, and he makes Scarborough a royal castle, And he sets about improving it in stone, starting with the keep in the 1150s, and that's what we see today. But that was likely because Scarborough was exceptionally well sited, if you've ever been there. It's perfectly naturally defensible, and it was a very advantageous castle to have. Many of the other minor castles which populated Yorkshire's mid-12th century landscape, especially ones that had no royal permission to be built, were taken down by Henry nearly as quickly as they had popped up. So the motte left at Yafforth is a prime example of this. It was only in use for about 20 years. It was built by a minor local lord, and he almost certainly did not have Hastings on his mind when he was building it. Even in those castles that were built in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, we can still see a wide variety of motivations and meanings depending on circumstance. In York, Domesday Book tells us that one ward of the city was vastata in castellis, so it was cleared of all housing. It was wasted for the building of the two castles. So the conquest would certainly have made an impression on the landscape and inhabitants of the city. The castles not only profoundly altered the skyline of the city, but they also refocused the locus of secular power from the pre-conquest seat of the Earls at Earlsborough, over by St. Mary's Abbey and St. Olaf's Church, to where the castles are now, to the confluence of the Ouse and the Foss, to control the riverine movement and the trade in and out of the city. It also dramatically changes York's waterscape with the damming of the Foss and the creation of the King's Fish Pond. And this caused the loss of quite a lot of land and housing, things like that. So York's castles and their impacts on the landscape were obviously very clear statements of the imposition of Norman power, and William's royal power particularly. And they were both practical and symbolic instruments of control of the most important city in the north. They were also clearly seen that way by the populace, because when they do rebel in 1069, they target the castles. So that's seen as the center of Norman power. But it should be noted that some research by David Roth in other parts of the country has found that there's some surviving documentation of compensation paid by the king after the conquest when land was cleared or confiscated for castle building. We don't have any records like that for York, and it's not clear whether the documents that Roth found and that do survive are unusual, or whether these compensatory measures were standard. So we simply, we might just not have the records to prove that this was going on, more often than we thought. But it sheds light on a process that seems to fit that standard narrative of Norman forcible imposition, but may have been more negotiated than it first appears. Richmond Castle in the Dales of North Yorkshire provides an interesting comparative example of the diverse roles that castle building could play during the conquest. Richmond was the center of a large and compact collection of estates in the northwest of Yorkshire known as the Honour of Richmond. And these had previously been lands held by Earl Edwin of Mercia, and they were granted to Count Alan Rufus by William in 1071, when Edwin dies. Before the conquest, the Earl's chief manor and his minster church had been sited at the manor of Gilling, which is just here. But instead of establishing the head of his honour there, Alan moves it a few miles south to Richmond, which is previously a kind of unimportant manor comparatively. It's unclear whether the parish church of Richmond already existed prior to the conquest, or whether it was founded for the first time alongside the castle. But at any rate, it was soon rebuilt in a grand cruciform style, and in a few years there was also a new Benedictine priory, a hospital, and a chapel in the new marketplace, which Count Alan had created just outside the castle gate. So this isn't so much a recovery for Richmond, but a whole new start in the Anglo-Norman world. In contrast to a lot of other places where Norman castles get sited directly on top of pre-existing Anglo-Saxon fortified sites, at Richmond, Alan seems to have considered discontinuity from the pre-conquest site of power as a more effective means of consolidating and expressing his authority in the post-conquest period. Gilling had been a wealthy manor, but it doesn't seem to have been a major market centre in the Anglo-Saxon period, and Gilling only had a small stream running through the settlement, whereas Richmond had a big navigable bit of the River Swale. And that's really important if you're looking to establish a new castle, because you need a lot of stone and it has to be transported by water. So he needed that to build this new town that he had in mind, and also the trade connections that it allowed him to access. Another key factor that differentiates Richmond from some of the other castles we just talked about is that it's a baronial foundation, not a royal one. Now, he's definitely doing this with William's permission, but his priorities in the post-conquest period were different than those of the king. The tenuous nature of Norman control in northwestern Yorkshire may have played a role in how Richmond Castle and town develops. The honour was very large, huge amount of land for him to control. It's full of very difficult terrain. I don't have a topographical map here, but there's dales all around here. And it's relatively poor as well. It's one of the areas in Domesday Book that has lots and lots of waste manors, so manors without value in 1086. And in order to successfully manage this landscape during this initial period of settlement, the Normans had to take on as subtenants a large number of both Norman knights as well as native landholders, so people who had hung on through the conquest. And maybe they get pushed down the ladder of tenancy a little bit, but they still get to get the lands. And as lord of a huge territory, populated with a very diverse community of potentially competitive and argumentative native and Norman subtenants, many with ambitions of their own, Alan would probably have felt the need to visibly express his command of resources and control of the region to help ensure their loyalty. He also had a really vested interest in convincing William that he was the right man for the job in this difficult section of North Yorkshire. So Richmond, its castle, and its brand new borough and market were undoubtedly a clear communication of Norman institutional power to the conquered populace. But they were at least as much, and maybe more, about Count Alan creating his own personal lordly identity, proclaiming his standing and legitimacy in the eyes of other Norman elites, and successfully securing his position in the post-conquest transition. Next, I want to talk about parish churches, and the honor of Richmond again serves as a useful case study for the complexity of the conquest in the north. So as I mentioned above, we've got an area that's relatively poor in Domesday Book, and lots of uninhabited or unvalued villas. And you have this mixture of native and Norman subtenants who own these manors. But there are also, maybe surprisingly, a substantial number of churches which were built in the late 11th century in the region. All of these dots here are churches which have physical evidence of patronage in the late 11th century at some point, so kind of prior to 1100. And that really complicates that inherent story of long-term waste and desolation laid out in the Chronicles. The unique characteristics of the region make it a really good place to examine another simplified assumption that we have about the conquest, that ethnicity and architectural style align with each other. So Normans build Norman architecture, natives build in pre-conquest styles. So if we look at the styles of architecture that we see in this area, and we look at the people holding the manors in the late 11th century, we see the church at Hornby. So it features this kind of tall, unbuttressed, ignore the top bit, but up to there, tall, unbuttressed, sort of pre-conquest style tower, this double belfry window, and this west door are very common features of kind of 11th century Yorkshire pre-conquest towers. In 1086, the tenant in place is Goss Patrick. He is a major Anglo-Scandinavian landholder in Yorkshire who held land before the conquest, and he retains his land and gets his father's land in 1086. So he really takes advantage of the shake-up and puts himself into a good position of power. And then at Danby Wisk, we have a patron who's a Frenchman, Landrick. And here in the late 11th century, we see the use of obvious Romanesque style wall moldings and capitals and things like that, and a tympanum with figures on it, very, very much continental Romanesque styles. So on the surface, these examples appear to demonstrate the Norman lords gravitate towards continental styles in the decades after the conquest, while native lords kept on using traditional English ones. But at West Hawkswell, the tenant was Ribold de Bretagne. He's a half-brother of Count Alan. He's a man clearly affiliated with the higher circles of the Norman elite. But in his church, we also see old-style features being used. There's herringbone masonry, there's kind of zigzaggy masonry. There's a built in there, a monolithic window head, a little one-stone round-arched window head. And also this square-headed doorway with a reused Anglo-Scandinavian cross shaft across the top. And all of that sits alongside very much new Romanesque style work in the south doorway and the chancel arch. And these, it's not entirely sure whether all these things are exactly the same date. The doorway might even be slightly later. So it complicates that simple alignment of ethnicity and architectural style. If patrons wanted, it shows that the styles didn't progress in a linear manner. You didn't just, all the Anglo-Saxon styles ended and all the Norman styles began. You could get both, depending on what you wanted and how much money you had and which architects you had access to. If patrons wanted a mature Romanesque style, you could get it in the 1070s and 1080s. We can see this in the church at Lastingham from 1078. It's built with monastic ambitions by some monks from Whitby, and they're under the patronage of the king. And less accomplished Romanesque, like we saw at Danby Wisk, is available to you too. But even when it's available, some people chose not to use it, or at least couldn't source the people with the technological know-how to build it. So rather than being a knee-jerk ethnic response, the use of a particular architectural style depends on the individual circumstances of the patrons, which included the availability of materials and craftsmen, their artistic knowledge and their technological skill, and how much you could afford to spend, as well as the socio-political situation of the patron and the church and the manor. In the parish church of Weaverthorpe, in East Yorkshire, we have an excellent example which we can explore in detail, all those sorts of stylistic choices. So this church conveniently is dated for us to 1110 to 1120 by a Latin inscription attributing the building to Herbert of Winchester, and he's chamberlain to Henry I. So he's a big deal in the royal court. But he gets granted estates in York and East Yorkshire in 1109. So Weaverthorpe has Romanesque style ashlar masonry, all these very neat built blocks, but it has a kind of Norman version of these double belfry windows that we saw in the earlier style. And it's got that tall, thin, unbuttressed tower, which is common in pre-conquest Yorkshire. And you can compare it with Warham-le-Street, which is on the left there. And it looks very similar. And Warham-le-Street, I recently did a lime mortar dating project with some very clever people from Queen's University Belfast, and that one came up as definitely pre-conquest, which we didn't know about before, so that's really cool. And this is what, this is what Norman churches at the same time in Winchester look like. So Herbert could definitely have gotten a church like this if he wanted, but he didn't. He chose something that looked like it fit in Yorkshire. And what's really interesting is that the inscription dating into the 12th century is part of a stone sundial set into the fabric. And this is a really common practice in pre-conquest 11th century Yorkshire. We also see them at Kirkdale and Old Byland and Great Edstone, all in the kind of mid to late 11th century, and all commemorating church building by secular Anglo-Scandinavian lords. So about 50 years after the conquest, a member of the southern Norman royal court thought it was worthwhile to build a church utilizing styles common to 11th century Yorkshire, as well as to commemorate the erection of his new church in the manner that had been favored by pre-conquest lords in the region. And a possible explanation for this may have to do with political maneuvers involving Herbert's son. So not long after he gets his Yorkshire lands, he gets his son, William FitzHerbert, an appointment as the treasurer of York Minster. He later becomes the Archbishop and St. William of York, so he does pretty good. But William served, when he starts, as steward of his father's Yorkshire estates. He grants Weaverthorpe Church to a priory in 1121. So it's possible that adopting very consciously Yorkshire stylings for this church, explicitly recalling the pre-conquest traditions that were well known in the area, was a material means of helping to secure William's advancement in the region. William was Herbert's presence on the ground in Yorkshire, and there may have been benefits of associating an outsider from Winchester with an architectural vocabulary which was valued and understood in the northern context. Benefits that a church in an ostentatiously southern style, which Herbert could have had if he wanted it, would not have provided. So sometimes it was more important to be old-fashioned than to build something in the latest, most up-to-date continental styles. So part of Anglo-Norman Yorkshire's recovery after the conquest was a respect and preservation of valued elements of the past, rather than destruction and overriding them. And we also see this in sculptural monuments, engraved monuments, which we're fortunate in Northern England to have a really thriving stone sculpture industry, both before and after the conquest. The Northeast is a hotbed of sculpture production from the 8th century. This continues into the 9th and 10th centuries in the Anglo-Scandinavian period. And after the conquest, we have the cross-slab tradition, which continues on until the Reformation. And in areas of the country that don't have a major pre-conquest tradition, the cross-slabs seem to just appear fully formed. But in the north, we get these really interesting transitional monuments, which have elements of both the pre- and post-conquest sculpture. So you can see these are the 10th century sculpture from York Minster, these crosses with interlace in between. And we can see the mimicking of this in the 12th century, but instead of interlace, you get this saltire or chevron decoration that's common in the Romanesque. And in this one from Durham, you actually get pure interlace, but mixed up here with chip-carved Romanesque designs and the use of shears. And these emblems only come in the cross-slab tradition after the conquest. And we can also see it in this standing cross from Fylingdales, or half of it. It has this plate head style, so with this plate behind the arms. And we can compare it with the 10th century plate head cross from Gilling West, where it looks almost exactly the same, but what we have at Fylingdales is a bit of chevron on the arms, so mixing those Romanesque styles. And at Bolham and Northumberland, but there's lots of other examples in Yorkshire and Durham, you get these coped monuments with kind of this tegulation, these roof tiles, and they're mimicking the 10th century hogbacks that we see. So these sculptural traditions, these transitional sculptural traditions, indicate the unbroken continuity of production, both before and after the conquest, maybe even the persistence of individual sculptures, but also the adaptation of patrons' tastes and requests, and how they start. Stylistic conservatism wasn't just a matter of money, it's choice. Patrons living through this turbulent transition may have seen value in respecting the traditions of the past while also embracing styles and forms that were championed by the new Norman elite. And we can also, for this last section, I'm going to move on to just some of the portable material culture that can inform us about the conquest. And one area where we may be able to clearly see the disruption of the conquest is in coinage and hoarding. York was very economically thriving in 1066, a well-established cash economy, so it's not surprising that people might have wanted to protect their wealth when they saw all this disruption coming. And more late 11th century hoards have been found in York than in other cities in England, which does seem to indicate that the inhabitants may have felt more threatened than those in other areas of the country, and perhaps that they were less likely than other regions to make it through the strife and collect the hoard again on the other side. But this doesn't only happen in the north. We found 2019, I think, the Chew Valley hoard near Bath in Somerset, where there's the biggest hoard of this period by far, which has coins from both the pre- and post-conquest period. So, and there are rebellions going on in that heartland of Wessex as well, but it doesn't seem to take over the narrative of Wessex in the same way that it does in the north. One of the interesting things about both the Chew Valley hoard and the coin evidence from York is that they both illustrate disruption, but also a well-known area of continuity between pre- and post-conquest England. And that is the moneyers, a number of whom are working in mints before the conquest, and they get kept in post and they continue to make money after the conquest. And even in places where the conquest was supposed to be particularly problematic, we can see this kind of pragmatic stability in minting. So these three coins of Edward the Confessor, Howard Douglas, and William I all seem to be minted by the same guy, Uthgar, of Anglo-Scandinavian heritage. And this is because not only would these guys have known the ropes, and it's very easy to keep them in place to keep the economy going, but this was valuable to everybody in the post-conquest period. It doesn't help the Normans if they're ruling over a kingdom of burning and no money. They need these things to keep going. So it's not just ideological. There's a pragmatism in that. And then pottery. This is another aspect of material culture where there's no strict dichotomy of continuity or change after the conquest. Both are present depending on location and circumstance. Until very recently, it was thought that the conquest had almost no impact on the production of pottery in Europe. We know before the conquest they're using Torksey ware from Lincolnshire and around, and that stops sometime in the 11th century. We're not sure because of the conquest or whether it fades out before that. But most of the time they're using things that go through the conquest, so gritty wares like this, sort of everyday tableware, and Stamford wares from further south. And these stay the same from the 10th all the way to the middle of the 12th century, when is the first time that we start to see something that isn't used prior to the conquest showing up in York. And that was thought to be... and I'm going to leave you with this image of St. Mary Bishop Hill Jr., because its tower is the oldest standing bit of architecture in York, but nobody knows whether it's pre or post-conquest, and I like that ambiguity for all the things I talked about today. But I hope this talk has convinced you that material culture is really important to our understanding of the conquest and the 11th and 12th centuries. And I think it's so for a couple of reasons. One, that it's enormously valuable to us now. It's some of the best surviving evidence of past social behavior, but also because it was extremely important to people at the time. In periods of social pressure and intense change, material culture was a way that people could display identities and allegiances, or compete with each other, or exert control, or orient yourself in the social hierarchy. And all of those things were really important to do when the world was changing around you. And then also, I hope you've taken away that different forms of evidence tell us different stories, and that's great. The documents tell us one story of resistance and retribution, and the coinage tells us about disruption, but also the resilience of individual moneyers and the pragmatism of the Norman elite. And pottery tells us about how continuity and change are not a dichotomy, but are happening right beside each other, depending on what the patron wants. Different patrons want. And churches and sculpture tell us not only about resilience and recovery, but another R word I didn't use, about respect for the past, for long-standing stylistic vocabularies and meaningful traditions. And so overall, what I hope you get from this talk is the vibrant complexity that characterizes the Norman conquest of the North, which is much more interesting than what we might have been